Russian President Vladimir Putin has hit back at Washington's latest sanctions, saying Russia will never bow to pressure from the United States or any other country. Now, Putin called sanctions an unfriendly act, warning they would have consequences, though he downplayed their economic impact, saying they won't significantly affect Moscow's financial stability.
First of all, there is nothing new here. Yes, they are of a serious nature for us, of course, this is understandable. And they will have certain consequences. But still, they will not significantly affect our economic well-being. This, of course, is an attempt to put pressure on Russia. Of course, this is an unfriendly act towards Russia. This is an obvious thing. And it does not strengthen Russian-American relations, which have just begun to recover. Of course, with such actions, the U.S. administration damages Russian-American relations.
And it's not just Russian-American relations. The direct impact of U.S. sanctions on Russian crude can already be seen on global crude prices. Oil prices rose as much as 5% on Thursday after the U.S. imposed these sanctions on major Russian suppliers, Rosneft and Lukoil, over the Ukraine war, extending gains from the previous sessions. Now, analysts argue the impact on sanctions on oil markets will depend on how India reacts to these sanctions and if Russia finds alternative buyers.
Oil prices surged almost 5% early Thursday. Markets reacted after the US put sanctions on leading Russian suppliers Rosneft and Lukoil over the Ukraine war. One analyst said the sanctions mean refineries in China and India will need to find other suppliers for oil, or they risk exclusion from the Western banking system. Both countries are major buyers of Russian oil. The US said it was prepared to take further action as it called on Moscow to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine. Britain sanctioned Rosneft and Lukoil last week. EU countries have approved a 19th package of sanctions against Russia, which includes a ban on imports of the country's LNG. Brent and West Texas Intermediate futures rose by more than $2 a barrel after the sanctions were announced. Analysts argue the impact of sanctions on oil markets will depend on how India reacts and if Russia finds alternative buyers. India became the largest buyer of discounted seaborne Russian crude after Moscow began its war in Ukraine. Industry sources said Thursday Indian refiners are likely to sharply cut imports of Russian oil due to the new sanctions. Another source said the top Indian buyer of Russian crude, Reliance Industries, plans to lower or stop such imports completely. But some analysts remain unsure on whether the sanctions will lead to a big shift in supply and demand.